In 2005, two Wisconsin brothers founded a silencer research and development company called Hearing Protection LLC. After escaping Hillary Clinton's dangerously mismanaged State Department security program, these brothers went full tilt into standing up their own firearms company. Today, still under the watchful eye of government regulatory agencies, they survive as entrepreneurs of fortune. If you have a problem, if you have shitty kit, and you're in desperate need of an upgrade, maybe you can buy Griffin Armament.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Dwell Time Podcast. I'm Evan Green, and this is Austin Green. We're the two owners of Griffin, and we are going to be doing a year in review today. So we're going to be talking about basically everything from our recollection of what we did this year, both inside the company and maybe some industry stuff, as well as maybe some current events. So the year always starts with, really, here in Wisconsin, the cold, icy death grip of winter. And so January and February are our darkest months, pretty much, in the state of Wisconsin. Really cold, so people are really just focusing on work, and some people are going on vacations. But SHOT Show is coming up. That's a big thing in January. And SHOT Show 2025 was actually really cool. I was excited for that show, even though we've gone so many times in the past, because Austin had some really killer products there that we were showcasing for the first time. Probably the most interesting, in my opinion, was the suppressor optimized bolt carrier group. That was one of the products that we had released right around that time, but we brought some examples, or I think we were releasing it right there actually. And that was really interesting. There was a lot of people from various companies that came into the booth to check it out. There was some companies that actually asked if they could potentially license that patent. Austin had basically created two different versions of that product. Do you want to talk about that product for just a minute?
Sure. The suppressor optimized bolt carrier group, we had one that was a flagship product, which had its own custom bolt, cam pin, firing pin. And that product had the extended cam pin path, in addition to the side vents that basically kick the gas out in a direction that essentially reduces sound when used in conjunction with a sound suppressor. Then we had the carrier only product, which just allowed you to put your mil-spec internals into the carrier. And later in the year, we had a full, more mil-spec style carrier that just had the anti-tilt and vents in conjunction with a Carpenter 158 bolt and S7 extractor. And that product is the most affordable embodiment of the product. I think we're offering it for like $12 or $13 upsell on a gun, something like that. So if you're buying like an upper or a rifle from us, you can option in the carrier and know that it dropped, anywhere from 2 to 3 to maybe 7 to 10 ear decibels, depending on your gas system length. It favors the longer gas systems. And we later in the year came out with an adjustable gas block, which was built and based on the micro MOA patents that we'd acquired a year or two earlier. So it took us a long time to get to that product. So now in tandem, a pair of products could be run to more fully optimize a rifle for sound suppressors. Right.
I remember when we were testing that originally, when you had cut the prototypes for that bolt carrier group. And like you just said, they merit, higher performance, multiple times higher performance on the longer gas systems. And the difference was really profound to me because, I've obviously been shooting AR-15s for, 20 plus years, never had the experience that I had when we shot those prototypes that day. And especially on the rifle length gas, like 16-inch guns, it was incredible.
Yeah, we tested that on an 18-inch SPR, so we didn't really understand, but we were testing more of an optimal use case at the time of the test. And so for us, it was like, holy shit, this is like orders of magnitude beyond anything that's going to be possible with sound suppressors, and since then we've gotten into additive manufacturing of suppressors, so we're in the development program on those, and we're realizing that there's kind of similar leaps in performance available in that technology. So it's like we're in a really golden space where we're able to bring together optimization of the rifle's gas system characteristics, optimization of the rifle's capability to produce noise with the sound suppressor, and the capabilities of sound suppressors in general are experiencing an uplift in performance. So it's all coming together.
Yeah, so that product really impressed me a lot. Obviously, like Austin said, on the shorter gas systems, it doesn't do as much. So like a carbine length 11.5-inch gun, you're only going to get maybe a 2 decibel difference. But on the mid-length, 14.5s and 16-inch guns, you're getting maybe like a 4 to 6 decibel difference. And like he said, on the 18-inch rifle length gas, you're getting like an 8 or 10 decibel difference. So the differences on the longer gun, it's really worth it, in my opinion, on the longer gas systems in the AR-15.
Yeah, and it was that we had dosing studies on that video, and I can't completely remember, but I want to say they were somewhere in the ballpark of like 450% or something like that increase in. It was a substantial increase in dosing on those long lengths especially. So it wasn't just a drop in sound, so a drop in peak hearing risk, but it was a quite a bit of extra rounds per week that AHA was saying that you could safely shoot.
Yeah, and Austin's referring to the Army's auditory human risk assessment algorithm, which basically determines a factor of safety for the product in terms of how many shots you could be exposed to in a week. And so he's saying that product increased that your ability to shoot an 18-inch carbine suppressed by 450%, which is pretty incredible. So that was honestly, I thought, the most exciting product that we had at SHOT Show, but we did have 2 others that were really interesting. One of them was the first additive suppressors that Griffin's ever come out with, which was the Optimus 6. Do you want to talk about that for a few minutes?
Sure. The Optimus 6 was a additive suppressor built with the technology we were considering picking up here. Ultimately, we picked up a different technology, the Renishaw machines, but we produced the Optimus 6, and it was a larger diameter can built around a very high flow rate, designed to accomplish this low back pressure capability thing with a relatively low flash signature for what it was doing. And the silencer sounded pretty great and had a lot of positive end user feedback and interactions. And so there's a lot of happy end users of the product. And we've since come out with an Optimus 7. So we have a 5.56 and a 30 caliber counterpart. And those are 2 really nice silencers. They are a little bit on the heavier side because they are so kind of large. And our additive machines are currently in development of silencers that are more typical footprinted. And the performance on those is really nice as well. So excited for the silencer, product category.
So the Optimus, my first experience with that product in, more large scale was actually in the spring. Griffin Armament has attended for the last several years the Capitol Armory Quiet in the Capitol demo shoot. A lot of people come, a lot of vendors are there, kind of an insane amount of vendors. But anyways, we ran maybe like 500 people through that AR-15 that had both the Optimus low back pressure can plus the bolt carrier group, the low pressure bolt carrier group. And almost everyone that shot it was kind of, you didn't have to tell them how the gun was configured. They just noticed that it was so low back pressure, and they were like, "Oh man, what is this?" And then secondarily, after they were done shooting it, we would describe the features of the gun that made it so low back pressure. So a lot of people were sold on it, due to the practical use of the product, which was really neat to see. Because when you're here at Griffin, we're oftentimes just speculating the negatives of everything ourselves, in an effort to enhance, the features, quality, performance of the product. So we're basically just constantly in critique mode, being negative on the product essentially, and not just negative, but like critiquing it for the positive, but looking for all the potential weaknesses. But when you get in, front of the public and people actually are interfacing with the product, 95% of the time, their reactions are positive, which is really cool. And it was nice to see that.
Yeah, I could say running the can myself, there was an initial reaction of, this is the nicest can that I have any recollection of using. So, I mean, while he's right, Evan is right that I do focus on the negative and look for any weaknesses in the product. There was definitely an observation of this can, albeit 18 ounces and larger in diameter than our normal cans, is the best performing single 5.6 can I've ever run. So that's definitely a positive.
Right. So that was the Optimus 6 was really well garnered for attention at SHOT Show, obviously the Bull Carrier Group as well. And then the third product, which we had launched, a few months or so prior to the show, but its first debut was the ambidextrous Mark II 9mm carbine. And that was something that I thought was super cool because I was myself an early adopter of the 9mm AR-15 kind of craze when it hit in like around 2010 timeframe. There was like a little bit of a rebirth of that type of product. Prior to that, obviously, it was just the Colt, 9mm, the DEA, Colt Commando 9mm carbine. But then in the early 2000s, there was a few companies that popped up with little developments on those guns that came out with, pretty extensive, work on Glock magazine compatible type AR-15 receivers for 9mm. So I had built several of those myself. We still have several of them here. None of those guns were actually really that reliable, which was kind of the downfall of them and why they eventually just stayed in the safe. As the listeners are listening to this, I'm sure everyone has been exposed to that type of firearm where you're like excited to buy it, excited to use it, excited to build it, whatever the case may be. But then once you actually start getting out and using it, it's shitting the bed on various ammo types. You're switching different ammos. You're switching maybe different magazines. You're trying to troubleshoot the reliability problems of the gun. Maybe you're switching a few little parts. You're taking it apart. You're looking at, geometric relations of the internal parts. You're seeing if you should tweak anything or, then the Dremel tool comes out and then other things come out. And eventually, sometimes you just get exhausted by the gun and then you just put it away and it lives in the safe. And then people come to your house and they're like, oh, what's this? And you're like, oh, that's, this gun, blah, blah, blah. And you're not like super happy about it. And you basically tell a story lamenting about this firearm, right? This was kind of that category of firearm. The 9mm AR-15 was kind of that category of firearm where Austin and I, and he was leading the charge on the product, but neither of us thought that it had ever really been executed really well, especially pertaining to reliability. And so I think that was the thing that we talked about most with this gun. And I think I'm most proud of Austin with the development and the work that went into it was the reliability of the firearm. And, since its launch, we've had several, really high ranking name brands that I won't mention have police departments replace those guns due to reliability problems with the Griffin Mark II 9mm gun because it is such a highly reliable platform. I tell people kind of colloquially that the Mark II 9mm is almost as reliable as a 5.56 AR-15. We've shot it a ton and it just does not stop. And so it's really cool. It's something that you could really rely on as a frontline type firearm. Not that you necessarily would in that caliber, but you could if you wanted to.
Yeah, we did make one revision after only a few of those were sold. We'd sold like, I think 35 or 40. And we decided, which is interesting because it's something that I think one of our influencers, maybe QVO Tactical, did. They took the buffer and spring and swapped it for carbine and like an H2 buffer. And we have swapped the spring to a plus 15 AR spring with an H2 buffer. What we were realizing was we don't really have the ejection issue. So this case going into the fire control pocket thing is not a factor. And we get a smoother recoil characteristic and it's easier on the bolt and bolt catch. So that modification happened. And I think the early adopters of that gun got buffers and springs in the mail, but that gun is a very reliable platform and it's a very elevated 9mm Colt style gun.
Here's a question that I've gotten quite a bit on the product. And actually one of my friends, in an organization outside of work, asked me, and he's a, older guy and has a ton of firearms experience, and he was asking me, why did you guys choose the Colt pattern magazine versus the Glock magazine? Do you want to take a minute to
The reason why that was chosen is because the Glock pattern magazine just doesn't support the AR manual of arms. So you end up with a system that doesn't have the magazine catch on the right-hand side of the gun, and you have a system with a weird Rube Goldberg device for the last round bolt hold open. And those two devices are just not serious parts. And really the AR-15, it's a double column magazine. It's not a single column feed magazine. It doesn't have the weird angle of the mag well that the Glock magazine has. It doesn't need the, it's like, was in a position of a very serious AR-15 development partner as the patent holders and license holders of the Armalite platform. And that rifle was deadly serious for Colt, and the Colt 9mm that they made, had a few compromises in that they put a magazine well insert into an existing AR-15 lower to take advantage of parts that they already had on the shelf. But the choice of magazine, the double column Uzi magazine, wasn't one of the major compromises of that system. It was the right choice, and it leaves the manual of arms intact and doesn't resort to these crazy little sheet metal pieces that try to execute bolt hold open from several inches in front of the bolt catch.
Right. And so if you crack a Griffin Mark II in half, you won't find those, like he said, extremely delicate stampings. There's really robust, high quality parts inside that gun, which is, one of the other cool things. I really like the aesthetics too of the Colt stick mag guns personally. I think the geometry aesthetically goes with the firearm much, much better. I also think that the old school kind of Rhodesian chest rigs with the vertical stick mags are pretty badass as well. And I think they just are supported a little bit better with the stick mags.
There is a little of that 80s heat style interesting cosmetic thing going on where the Colt 9mm gun is just a cooler gun.
Yes, it is much more OG and so cooler.
So on the one hand, you've got these, I want to have interoperability of my magazine between my primary and secondary guys, and that's a point, but in this case, it's just too many compromises.
But anyways, that product was really cool, is really cool. I'm really proud of that. Another question that I've had is, why do you guys choose a metal form magazine? Is that important that you ship it with that magazine? And it is important. We tried several other magazines, and we actually had to ship back a pallet of magazines from another manufacturer that were not as reliable. So the metal form magazine is 100% the magazine that you should purchase, in multiples to support the gun.
Yeah, the provider we're talking about, we won't mention for professional reasons, but they had rebated the feed lip on the magazine backward 3/16 of an inch, or about 6mm, something like that, 230 thou. And it just didn't have the ideal control of the rounds in the magazine. So you could grab them with your thumb and flip the rounds up at the cartridge nose. And how that applies to 9mm subguns is when you put a silencer on them, sometimes wind comes back through the barrel, and that has a tendency to want to flip cases upward. And so you'd execute failure to feeds based on the rounds not being in the correct attitude to be stripped from the magazine. That metal form magazine is, I believe they're an OEM, or were a one-time OEM to Colt. So it's like you're getting a very high quality steel magazine from a direct OEM producer.
Right. So moving on from SHOT Show is great. Obviously a lot of new products that we had. Then we went to, like I said, to that demo shoot. That was one of the things we do. Griffin Armament is kind of somewhat isolated in the upper Midwest. We're in Wisconsin, so we're not super local to a lot of the events that go on throughout the year in the firearms industry. We do make it to some of them, but heading into this spring, I know that's when more press was coming out on the 1-10 optic that Austin helped develop. That was something that was launched, and I think went over really well.
Yeah, that optic, it was funny. I put a lot of work into and launched it, and I had a good feeling about it. And the only negative concern of the optic was weight. The zero limiting both windage and elevation knobs, for example, required quite large knobs to be manufactured to get the number of clicks we wanted in one revolution to occur. because we wanted to be able to take a rifle such as like a 6.5 or a 308 rifle out to 1,000 yards with, one turn of the knob. So you couldn't get lost on a different revolution. There's optics that have second revolution or third revolution indicators. This wasn't one of those optics. And, one turn of the elevation is nice because you can't be at zero on a different rev. So it's less confusing. And I had a feeling that optic should do a lot better than it initially did. And eventually it found its way just by sheer happenstance into M110 SAS's testing of, I think it was best budget LPVO. And he tested, I think, 6-8 options or something like that from mainstream companies like SIG. Ultimately, we won that competition, which was totally coincidental. And at that point, the optic became popular. We sold out, had to go to a second run, and the optics have only just gotten back into stock. That was a neat optic, a really high quality optical system with neat features like you'd find on M40 A1 optic from Unerdal, the MST 100, one turn BDC and stuff like that capability.
Right. Also, one thing I didn't mention, just because the optics weren't fully launched at that time, but at SHOT Show, we did have our 1X and our 3X prism optics on display. We didn't have inventory at that time, so we were just kind of showing them off to business buyers, but they were very much, through development at that point. I had really no prior experience to prism optics. I'd heard of them. When Austin said he wanted to do them, I didn't really honestly just know very much about them.
I think the ACOG is technically a prism optic. I want to say it's got a prism. It's got is that like a binocular, right?
The ACOG.
So you would have experience with the ACOG.
Yeah, I had experience with the ACOG. Sure. I had experience with, the aim point red dots in overseas as well as the EOTech products. So, decent amount of optics experience, but really I'd not looked through, modern prism optics. I was really surprised, to look through those. And I think this is probably true of the product category in general, is that the image sharpness and clarity and the sharpness of the reticle is really kind of impressive. And so I think for people that have astigmatisms, to where the red dot is not a crisp circle, to where you see that red dot flare and things like that, I think that's where the prism really can help those people, right?
Yeah, and most people have astigmatism of some sort. So a lot of people don't see the dots clear. And also, if the batteries aren't on, you can still see your reticles, which is something I've always liked about magnified optics.
Because they're edge glass.
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah. Which is nice.
Yeah, I ran a 3-9 in Iraq in 0405, and I had illumination that I would only very rarely use. Like I'm on a night mission and I want a little contrast, it would go on light, or I'm using night vision and I want to be able to better have contrast to my reticle. But otherwise, that I didn't ever turn the illumination on, and always had a way to aim my rifle.
So the prism reticle, I think, is really impressive, like I said, because it's so crisp. One thing I noticed is that when you first get the prism optic, there's an ocular focus, towards your eye on it. You have to set that. That's really critical to set, because if you zoom too far out, the object will look, like less than 1 power or 3 power if it's a 3 power. And if you zoom too far in, it'll magnify over that power range that you're trying to hit. So you really need to be careful to, properly adjust that ocular focus. But once that's set, you basically never touch that again. And then you just use the optic, as you would.
Yeah, working with optics, that was one of the more interesting things that I learned. They did not teach that in sniper school. We obviously put the optic up against the sky and then just focused a reticle. And they would talk about how different scopes had slightly different attitudes regarding range estimation. And the reality is that as you change the ocular focus of the optic, you actually, to some extent, impact the magnification on a small scale. So the ideal thing to do when setting up an optic, especially one that has like a mil-dot reticle or a reticle that has, BDC or something like that, would be to take an item of known size at a known distance and focus until that optic properly scaled that reticle feature. And that's easiest to do with the 1 powers. So like on our 1 to 10, you can just flick the power ring to 1 power, focus the eyeball with both your eyes open, looking at something like a fence line where you can see the top and bottom of it in both the scope field and your eyeball that's off the scope. And those items should, when they reach the correct identical size, then you have achieved that point at which the ocular focus allows the ranging of the reticle to be most accurate.
Right. And so that was something that I noticed with the prisms that's really important, is the ocular focus is important. And some people might be, asking, I've seen like posts on Reddit, for instance, has anyone checked out Griffin Armament? The optics, blah, blah, we're known to be a suppressor company. That's where the company started, its manufacturing efforts. Back when the company was founded in 2005, 20 years ago, 100% of the efforts were silencers, and they started with 22 cans, working our way, progressing upwards. And something like 10 years ago, we started making AR-15s. And some people might be thinking, well, why is Griffin doing optics? What gives them the license, or what makes them a credible, source for optics? And Austin and I had been using optics ever since we were kids, like many of you. So we had a lot of field experience using different types of optics. That was back in the day when a lot of these optics companies did not exist. The only ones that were out there really, were Tasco, Bushnell,
Redfield,
Leupold. There was not a whole lot of companies out there that you could get your hands on optics. Most of those optics, those name brand optics companies were, at your local sporting goods shop. Most of them were duplex reticles. Most of them were, really kind of basic optics by today's standards. You look back to World War II and you look at the optics then, and you're like, holy crap, these things were old school. But so optics technology has developed quite a bit over the years. And when we were still kids, actually, we started mail ordering kind of exotic scopes from Europe and Czech Republic and things like that. Veldata, some German optics. So we were actually getting our hands on, high end, because people knew at that point European optics were higher quality in terms of the glass quality.
Hence the brand Euro Optic. It was known that if you want great optics, you go to Europe.
Right. That was a known thing, but most people couldn't even.
Zeiss, Kalles, Hensoldt, Schmidt and Bender.
Right, Swarovski. Most people couldn't even buy those, back in the day, though, in like the 90s, because a lot of the major retailers in the United States were not carrying those brands. So the only way that you could really get those brands is through like mail order catalogs. You'd never even looked through the scope. You just knew that it was supposedly really good.
Yeah, and that could be really disappointing, because with like the Veldata, for example, you get coatings that might turn everything like a slight bluish tint. And you'd be like, oh, geez, that just screws with my OCD to look through this slight bluish tint. And it'd be like, oh, I'm going to sell this optic on something like the AR-15 Equipment Exchange, and on to the next one, U.S. Optics. I'll try U.S. Optics.
Yeah, or you didn't look at the specs really closely, and that scope was 40 ounces, and you didn't know it. And so now it's like, holy shit, this thing's heavy. I didn't know.
It's a tank.
Right, because you couldn't go walk into the retailer and actually pick it up and handle it and look through it and things like that. But anyways, so, once we came with the AR-15, we did the iron sights. Austin had his heart set on doing optics mounts, scope mounts.
Optics mounts were a category we started in like 2011, so we got a lot more time in optics mounts than a lot of people probably understand.
Right, but optics mounts were really a logical segue to doing the optics themselves. We had a desire, for whatever reason, to start doing that and pushing those products, making them better. And then it was really just obviously a logical segue that, hey, if we're doing the optics mounts, we may as well do optics as well. The company's nearing, I think it's third year about into optics, and it's going pretty well for the most part. We started with, the red dot in the 1 to 8 power optic, added the 1 to 10, added the prisms. Just recently, we came out with a box style.
Yeah, heads up sight. And basically, that's a reflex sight with a large glass window. It has a shock isolating hood. It has integral flip open caps, so the lenses are protected from like snow, rain, dust during storage. And it takes a 3-volt lithium battery and is Picatinny rail mountable. And that's a neat optic, for like if you are a close range carbine guy, or perhaps like have a shotgun like a Benelli M4 or something you want to put a sight on.
And some people just like that square view versus a circle view. I mean, there's so many different, reasons why one person might gravitate towards one product versus another.
It's a much bigger window than a traditional reflex sight.
Right, larger window. So the optics have been really kind of exciting and fun. They've gotten us a little bit more out to the range. They're fun to do the workup on, the developmental workup on, ask questions internally. How big do we want to make these MOA dots? What do we want the reticles to look like and stuff like that. It's cool to actually have the capability to modify that stuff when, as a consumer, obviously you're buying what's out there. You can't make it your own. And not to say there isn't tons of great options out there, because there is, but it's just neat to be able to do something.
Yeah, sometimes you pick up an optic and you're like, this is a really neat optic. It's too bad the reticle is just so useless, or something of that matter, or like, this is a great optic, but I can't walk away from this rifle and come back to it with the confidence that somebody didn't grab my shit and rip the elevation knob one revolution, and it doesn't even have pitch ladders, or zero stops, so I have no idea. I lose my intrinsic confidence in my rifle.
Right. And so product development wise, there was just a ton of work going on. At the same time, in parallel, there was work and development going on with sales programs to make those products more reachable to customers. We actually have brought on 2 different sales programs for silencers and firearms in the last couple of years. One of them is a to your door program. So we partnered with Capital Armory to provide silencers to your door. So if you're someone who lives in, kind of the middle of nowhere, like rural America, which is kind of where I live, and you don't want to drive, an hour to get to your dealer, you can purchase a suppressor right off of our website, do the digital back and forth, communication and whatnot to get your fingerprints and whatnot, passed on. And we'll actually send you a fingerprint kit in the mail, so you can just do them right at home. And then you can buy a suppressor basically and get that thing shipped right to your residence, which is really cool. Another thing that we've done is we've developed a ship to your dealer option, which is really awesome, because there's, I think, something like 20,000 FFL dealers in the database. So if you go on Griffin Armament's website and you want to buy a firearm or a suppressor, and you want to ship it to the dealer because you want that dealer experience, you want to be able to walk in, shake someone's hand, have them kind of give you the white glove experience of going through the paperwork and all that stuff and whatnot, then you can choose to ship it to your dealer. And because there's so many dealers on that database, you can actually, at least for the FFLs, for the SOTs, there's not quite as many, obviously, because there's a lot fewer people that hold SOTs. That's the special occupational tax, in order to transfer the silencer. But for the FFLs, there's just tons. So, if you're buying a strip lower receiver off the website or something like that, or a full-blown Mark II, you can ship it to a dealer who's maybe 7 miles from your house, which is really awesome. And you can see on our website, how well is that dealer reviewed? Are they a 4-star dealer? Do they have the brick and mortar presence? Are they preferred by Griffin, meaning that we've done a considerable amount of business with them in the past and we know they're legit? So those programs have had like a 98.5% throughput of sales, meaning that if you're a customer and you're looking at this stuff and you're like, I don't know, like, is this going to be like this weird website where I bought this thing and then the order was in limbo for 6 weeks and I had to harass them to get it? Like, that's not the case. So these programs are really nearly flawless. They're the logistical smoothness on them is awesome. And those sales programs have helped our customers gain access to our products, because it is really hard. Austin's done a tremendous amount of product development, and it's been really hard over the years to try to get those products injected into the traditional supply lines of the industry, through distributors and dealers. Dealers are handling a lot of brands. They have a lot on their plate. They can't be up to date on every damn SKU that Griffin Armament comes out with, and that's where, if you're a consumer and you want to shop off of our website, everything is supported, which is cool. And that was something that I wanted for years to do. It was just a really tough Pandora's box to kind of figure out, but we have figured that out, and that's been great. So moving on, then throughout that stuff, as Austin had, little glimpses of time here and there, he was researching 3D printing because we wanted to get into that. I know he's been wanting to get into that for like 10 years probably. I think we've done a whole podcast on this, but just for a few minutes, talk about why you selected the technology you did, why you're excited to do it.
I don't know if I can't remember if we did a podcast or not, but I definitely was looking at the Russia SLM machines, and other machines in the market. And, I had a hope that technology would come down in pricing, as a lot of technologies do when they become more mature and when broader end user acceptance happens and volume of sale obviously increases. This just wasn't one of those things. And I think that was also due to some other factors like COVID, inflation happened, and, epic money printing under the last administration. And I guess they're gearing up to print a lot of money right now. So, really, I guess don't hold cash, maybe buy guns or something, because when they inflate the currency, the guns will become worth more money. But the machines are like that. So this was a case in which the technology matured a lot, the end user base grew, but the machine prices actually went up. They didn't come down, and that's just, economic factors of today. And that was the biggest struggle in the adoption of the machines was, whenever you're doing something new, there's considerable risk that you're having to take, because you're told something works. And, oftentimes with like CNC machines, we find out that, there's tool load monitoring issues, or there's, idiosyncrasies like the way the machine handles coolant, high pressure coolant. Maybe with one of the brands we had, there were leaks, and there was a lot of work and lost time associated to keeping the machine coolant in the machine, because, the facility just isn't built to have coolant on the floor. We're currently doing that with a one old machine we bought for a vestigial, machining technology that we needed to add here. But basically, when you're taking that kind of risk, you'd like the pricing to be more
As good as it can be.
more inviting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the better deal you
Because
get.
it reduces the risk.
It reduces the risk. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Because God forbid, maybe you can't tackle it and you have to move on the equipment, which sometimes happens in industries.
And there's also things like the service finish of parts. Do we think the market will?
We actually bought equipment from Cummins earlier this year because they had, the diesel engine company, because they had essentially invested a ton of money in equipment that they really couldn't figure out how to support an upstart. And so they essentially liquidated brand new equipment.
Oh, it was from one of the biggest companies in America, and they were implementing a technology from, and it just turned out that additive technology from just a enormous company in America just wasn't ready for mainstream. And so they were overpromised, under-delivered, and that application didn't work in production. And so it's an example of how terrible things can go in new technology implementations. And America's automakers have spent immense fortunes on trying to prop up and help additive companies to develop technologies that they can use to produce parts at the kind of volumes that they need to support cars. Some of our industries are actually big enough that, it's like if you go to the Henry Ford Museum, you see a giant, I think it might be a 8,000 horsepower generator that was of a design that Ford custom designed and had built to make their own power for their automotive plant. It's pretty cool stuff. At Tesla, they talk about this giant die casting machine. Elon has incredible amounts of resources, probably well exceeding those of Henry Ford. Henry Ford had a lot of significant hurdles that he overcame to make his company what it was.
One of the things that I'm proud of with the 3D printing that I had nothing to do with, but I'm still proud of it because it's a company, but is acquiring the machine technology here inside the facility. Most of the companies that are doing the 3D printed suppressors are ordering those units from 3D printing companies. Not to say that that's, there's still work in the designing of it. There's still work in, you got to order it, you got to bring it in, you have to do some post-processing to it. You have to sell it, obviously market it, do customer service on it. So there's still a lot of work there, but it does give me more pride knowing that we are 100% vertically integrated on that product, that we're buying the powdered metal, that we're running the printers ourselves. We're doing the depowdering. We're doing all that work, and seeing that implementation was super cool because Austin was able to do just a phenomenal amount of prototyping in such a short amount of time. He probably prototyped, due to the fact that we own the equipment, a year or two worth of calendar time that someone would have to subcontract to a printer. He probably did in
maybe a month. Yeah.
And that kind of was one of the, immense advantages to having the equipment, is the ability to rapidly prototype and develop models that we will be launching soon that really had a couple of years of R&D in them by companies who did not own the equipment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely showed how being on the outside looking into a technology, there's a difference to actually fully understanding and having it at your fingertips. Because from the outside looking in, you'd say a 45-degree angle rule is pretty prohibitive. And it is, where conventional machining technologies can make 0-degree surfaces flat to the linear axis, whereas the laser wants to be building at 45 degrees. But one of the things that is a tremendous advantage of the laser additive machine is that we can, where conventionally we make a design or a couple different designs, select the best performer and make small incremental adjustments to that product to make it a better product. With the laser additive thing, you can take extreme detours and make incredible near total overhauls of product without much investment of time. So that's a tremendous benefit, where with machining, to make a full overhaul, you might be back to like 2 weeks of CAD CAM type involvement, where with additive, you might be able to fully overhaul a design in one day, like 12 or 14 hour day.
Right, because you're doing the CAD, but you're not doing the CAM, essentially. Or you are doing a little
bit. Right. Yeah, you're still putting the machine through a software to develop code to manufacture it. But unlike, CAD CAM, you're not literally having to select each tool to make each geometry, create code for each tool, then make sure your code is comprehensive, like with a part transfer, and get out to a guy on the floor who has to physically set up tools in a machine. It's like there's a lot of inherent time loss in the conventional process versus the additive one.
Right, because some of the really complex turning programs have 20,000 lines of code. I've seen some of them where they're ridiculous.
Yeah, they can. If you had some high-speed machining in there, you can have 6,000-7,000 lines of code on one operation, and that might be beneficial to like doing something three-dimensional or doing something that better gives you tool life.
Right. So having to qualify all that code each time at the machine,
Yeah, especially if there's an error, like if the CAD CAM program like posts something around 0 and the machine doesn't want rotation about the 0-degree travel range, then you're tremendously fucked.
Right. And so the 3D printers do not, replace all existing technology, but they add to it in a way that is going to help our company with better throughput, more technologically cutting edge, if you will, designs and things like that. And the performance of those designs, which is cool. I was able to see with the prototyping, nearly instantaneous changes from one model to the next, which was only a 24-hour essentially build cycle with the machines, to print a new prototype, get it out of the machine, work it, bring it to the range to do flash testing and sound testing. In a 24-hour cycle, we could basically do a whole new prototyping life cycle. Whereas, like you said previously with the CNC machine, that might take a month.
Or 2 solid weeks anyway, and then when you have 2 weeks of a hurdle to making a major overhaul, you're more likely to make small changes to try to enhance the design you have, than to make a major overhaul. Whereas if the major overhaul is easier, you can get to a point and say, you know what, this design direction is screwed. Let's make a complete overhaul, 180, and bang, 24 hours, and you're into something else that might perform, quite a bit better, and that you can then, from there, develop.
So the 3D printing thing is an interesting, thing. In the middle of that development, that's when Trump started really dialing up, hard the tariffs this year, which were extremely difficult to, work through. Essentially,
they began pulling strings on the economy and kind of grotesquely manipulating the economy to the point where no business, no matter how big or how small, had a great ability to be on top of and abreast of what was happening.
And I think it's important to talk about one thing when it comes to tariffs, which is I think there's something that's very unknown by the U.S. consumer concerning tariffs, and that is that the U.S. company pays the tariff. So a lot of people think that these other countries are paying the tariff. That is not the case. Whatever company wants to import that good, they are paying the federal government the tariff percentage to import that good. So if the tariff is a 40% tariff or a 59% tariff, instead of $100,000 for that product, they're paying $100,000 to the manufacturer still, the foreign manufacturer, but then they're paying $59,000 to the U.S. government. And so all this money that's been, bragged about that the government is generating, it's coming from the pockets of Americans. It's an additional tax. And when the administration has said way back when, when tariffs drove the federal, taxation,
income tax.
There was no income tax. It's like, well, the funny thing is there is still income tax. They didn't impose the tariff and reduce the income tax or remove the income tax. They just increased and added an additional tax.
As an American, that's the most disturbing thing, is that anymore it's like death by 1,000 cuts. Like, we have quite extensive income tax. We already have sales tax. We already have taxes on things like gas. Like, I think the tax on gas in this state is like 52 cents a gallon. So that increases the price of gas to all the consumers. But we also had recently, a few years ago, the South Dakota versus the Wayfair case, and they made what was called internet sales tax, whereas previously people could buy things from out of state, tax exempt, and this worked. Okay, that's just a piece of the economy that worked, because reporting sales tax to thousands and thousands of individual entities, sometimes like 3,000 to 6,000 in one state, and you've got 50 states in the union to try to report these individually different taxes
for counties, special county taxes.
The accounting just blows up, and what happens in America is like a parasitic drag. A company now has to have a person who half their time is dedicated to filling out forms, and they have to bring on a software that has some grotesque $30,000 or $60,000 a year price, and that essentially has to have a plugin custom built to their website. And also that when a customer, in Nome, Alaska buys, a muzzle device, they can be assessed the appropriate sales tax for their individual county and state
jurisdiction.
And jurisdiction. Each company in the United States has to be registered with thousands of entities through these softwares that cost tons of money. It's like what we're doing in America through these regulations. It's like for every 100 people, we now need 2 people who deal with, state tax compliance, for example. And it's like we just delete people from our working functional economy of manufacturing of goods and delivery of services, on and on and on, as if we have an infinite number of bodies to delete all useful productivity from.
Yeah, and an infinite amount of profit margin, which is not the case either. So as companies have to, navigate the regulatory burden, they're reducing their profit margin all the time because these employees are not adding to, the actual goods and services in the GDP. They're, essentially cranking this function of helping the government crank this function of taxation.
Of divesting money from the citizenry.
Right.
So
it's pretty sick. Also, payroll tax is another tax, property tax, sales and use tax.
This year we saw the devastating actual consequences in other than the national debt of the Obamacare healthcare because the subsidies ended. And the Republicans thought, let's just let these expire and we can blame the Democrats. And it's like, yeah, but you're there too, and you have to solve these problems. So now the business has the internet sales tax additional cost, which of course makes consumers less likely to buy a thing. So it reduces the overall amount of economic mobility in the economy. And then they have the additional, for example, tariff cost, and then the healthcare cost. So you keep tacking on again. It's like this, the economy right now is slowing down because businesses are like a snowball, and the government just keeps rolling the snowball over a snowy pasture.
And the average,
and they get more and more bloated.
The average Wisconsin company's health insurance premiums for their employees has gone up 30% this year, which is just insane. It's a staggering amount. And so if your health insurance goes up 30%, now you're thinking, okay, those people that we wanted to hire, maybe we shouldn't hire them because their health insurance is going to be 30% more expensive than we thought.
Yeah, and we have more jobless people than ever because the economy is turning down. And so it's a good time for a company to hire. It's an employer's marketplace, but you can't feel good about hiring the people amid the rising costs. And that's why the people are surplus in the jobless market. And these factors all coexist in the same space.
Right.
So it represents just a really, really reckless, for example, with material. We buy material from an American mill and
several different American
mills. Sure. And one in particular, when this tariff thing kicked off, they were seeing an initial influx of business to America as the companies that were purchasing foreign material move it to America. And they told us, you're capped at blank and you can't buy any more American material from us. And we go to another mill and we can get some material allocated from them because they have a similar strategy of let's develop more customers. Albeit now the material is at 1.5 times normal cost. I think something like that, 1.5. So we're paying essentially a 50% tariff for this American stock because the tariff action
has
inflated the good price.
The tariff has basically created a monopoly for the American company, so it's way more powerful than it was before, which, hey, that's great for that company. But everyone that it's feeding, all the vendors that it's feeding essentially
are going broke.
They can't get the material anymore now because there's way more business for that provider. And so that provider then splits and allocates all of its production capacity to its existing customer base at lower quantities because it wants to bring in new customers and make new customers. The existing clients now can only purchase smaller quantities, and what that does is it pushes the existing customers to foreign markets. So the tariff actually kind of works inverse to its intention.
At this point, we've seen the American mills actually come full circle, and now they have available time because the short-term benefit to the American economy of the tariff has already ended, and the marketplace is depressed because the economic purchasing due to consumer costs that the businesses have to move to the consumer to survive have slowed down the purchasing, and now the short-term windfall for the American company has already died.
And when Austin says
what Ronald Reagan said happened, it made the American company less competitive to have the tariff help.
And when Austin said moving the tariff cost to the customer, we as a company are eating a lot of that in terms of reduction in net profit. So we are holding our prices stable or trying to as much as possible. And we're losing a lot of net profit from this.
That's a factor that you can only do for so long because you're like, I'd like to see the other end of this and I'd like to hold my price and see the other end of this. And this is where when Donald Trump says, they'll eat the cost. It's like, yes, for a short time, they will eat the cost and then they will all raise the prices. And we buy products from other American companies and we've seen a lot of goods go up. And in the best cases, we've been dealing with companies that eat 25% of the tariff costs. And we've adopted that model too for our customers that if a tariff affects a good, then we're going to eat 25% of that, but the consumer is going to eat the other 75. And ultimately, we're both Americans, us, the company, and the consumer. We're Americans, and Americans eat all the tariff. and it just devastates our economy and only solely helps the government. The real path to prosperity and success would be a reduction of regulation and taxes and a reduction of the printing of fiat currency such that the money becomes more stable over time. Inflation reduces and the costs go down so that our companies can be more competitive in the international marketplace. It's great that we have achieved things like 0% tariff on our goods going to Europe, but the other thing that goes hand in hand with that rate change is that our goods have to be competitive with their marketplace, and that deals with regulatory costs becoming diminished and our currency value going up with the lack of inflation, such that we get to a point where we can fairly compete with the global market in things like commodity products, cars, for example.
Yeah. And so in summary, basically our company has, and every company, I'm sure, out there in the firearms space has been dealing with a lot of stress and headaches related to taxes and finances this year. Our net profit has reduced by maybe 40% this year as a result of this stuff, which that hurts your ability, obviously, to make additional investments in capital equipment, people, products,
to create jobs,
products, et cetera. So it stagnates the economy, which obviously we saw a significant dip in the stock markets in the last month. So it'll be interesting to see what next year holds.
Our market is one of the rare marketplaces where we have something regulatorily positive happening. It's just depressing to see Pam Bondi's DOJ fighting tooth and nail for keeping the silencers in the NFA, because what it shows is that the aim was to give us one little tiny metric where Americans could feel like they got helped. It wasn't the overall greater goal of Americans being freer people.
When the government recently, the Trump administration is buying federal stake in publicly traded companies like NVIDIA and Intel. And
not buying, they're making some kind of backdoor negotiation and being given stake in those companies under some kind of rule that they can take it, I believe.
They're claiming national security, which everything the government does that's illegal is under the auspices of national security. And that's what makes it legal, which is ridiculous. By the same token, we should have hand grenades and rocket launchers due to
our own national security,
for our own personal security related to the Constitution. If the federal government can use its argument that way to wield a hammer whenever it wants to, that's
one of those things. It's a class called arms. The Second Amendment is about arms. It's not about firearms. It's about arms. Arms are all the things we use for war. We also have ITAR licensing. That's International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, is what that stands for. So the same people that say that arms only applies to a firearm and not a silencer, they tell us that because we make a silencer, we need to have an ITAR's permit. And that is an omission. That arms means what it always meant in the Oxford Dictionary. It means the things that you use to wage war. And we actually have a constitutional right to have all those items that he just mentioned. As ludicrous as it may sound, we had privately owned cannons that helped us successfully negotiate the Revolutionary War that allowed this country to exist in the first place.
Right. And at that time, that was the most pinnacle of armaments at the time.
Yeah, it was state-of-the-art technology capable of fending off the imperial power of the day, the United Kingdom, which had the world's strongest standing army, and the capability of godlike capability on the seas, the ability to take war across an ocean to our country, and nearly fight it to a point of winning.
Right. So anyways, that kind of brings us to the end of 2025. It was a pretty action-packed year, a lot of work. 2026, we're going to be, trying to wring out all the capability of our printing department as well as our other manufacturing departments. Hopefully there's an uptick in volume of sale.
Associated with that $200 tax falling off.
Right. And our company's made significant investments in
silver lining,
essentially wagering that bet that there will be an uptick, which I think most of the companies have.
And that's been a financial strain to kind of push everything to the limit to be ready for next year. So additional material and stuff like that.
Yeah, we have maybe 3 times the raw material that we typically keep on hand. It's kind of insane how much raw material we have right now, but we're hopeful that next year will be a big year and we'll see what happens.
When we made the beginning of that strategy, the economy wasn't nosediving. However, we know that that uptick should hopefully offset, and it's like hopefully that'll be above a flat normal year, because that's what the American workers deserve in this case. You know, people here at this plant have put a lot of work into opportunity.
Right. Anyways, thanks for listening to this episode of Dwell Time, year in review. Enjoy the hunting season. It's going on right now. A lot of people here at the shop are getting deer kills and stuff like that up here in Wisconsin. And enjoy the Christmas holiday, and we'll see you at SHOT Show. Thanks.
You